Elon Musk has spent billions on energy innovation, but when he discovered this self-powered invention from Africa, he tried to buy it and was turned down flat. The story begins with whispers about a small team of African engineers working quietly in a workshop far away from the glare of Silicon Valley. They were not funded by billionaires, nor did they have massive labs with robots and endless resources. Instead, they worked with determination, resourcefulness, and a vision to create something that could change humanity forever. Their invention was not another battery, not a solar panel, not even a new type of fuel. It was something much bigger, a device that generated its own power endlessly without the need for refueling or recharging. A self-powered generator that could run homes, cars, factories, and even entire cities without relying on the traditional grid. When the news leaked out, it spread like wildfire in underground energy forums, and eventually the whispers reached the ears of the world's most powerful innovators. Among them was Elon Musk, the billionaire behind Tesla, SpaceX, and some of the most ambitious energy projects in history. Musk has always been obsessed with energy, from solar panels and battery storage to electric cars and even Mars colonization. So when he heard about this African device, he was intrigued, skeptical, but also determined to see it for himself. His team reached out discreetly, offering first a partnership, then a generous investment, and finally, an outright purchase offer. The Africans listened, but in the end, they refused. Why would anyone turn down Elon Musk, one of the richest men alive, offering them what could have been billions of dollars? The answer lies in the deeper story of who these inventors are, what they built, and why they believe their creation should stay in Africa. The device itself looks deceptively simple, no larger than a small suitcase, yet capable of producing continuous electricity without being plugged into anything. Tests showed it could run appliances, charge vehicles, and power lights without ever needing to be connected to the grid. It was not magic, but it looked like it. Inside were carefully designed magnetic systems, coils, and control units that tapped into forces that mainstream science rarely acknowledges. The engineers called it a self-powered unit, but others began to call it Africa's free energy box. As soon as people saw videos of it, running fans, lights, and even refrigerators, the excitement was overwhelming. For communities long suffering from blackouts, high fuel prices, and unreliable electricity, this was more than a device. It was freedom. And that is exactly why Elon Musk wanted it. To him, this could fit into Tesla's vision of sustainable energy, a way to leapfrog batteries and solar farms and push humanity closer to total independence from fossil fuels. But there was a problem. For Musk, ownership meant integration into his corporations, subject to patents, market pricing, and corporate control. For the African inventors, ownership meant something entirely different: liberation for millions of people who had been ignored, exploited, or left behind by global powers. So when the offer came, they smiled, thanked him, and said no. Musk was shocked, his team even more so, because rarely does anyone refuse such an opportunity. Billions of dollars, global fame, factories, and resources were all on the table, yet these inventors walked away. Because for them, money was not the mission. The mission was to prove that Africa could invent world-changing technology and that it did not have to be sold to outsiders to be recognized. For decades, Africa has been painted as a consumer continent, a place that imports technology rather than exports it. But here, in a modest workshop, a group of engineers flipped that story upside down. And they were not going to let anyone take that away. News began to spread beyond Musk's team. Other investors from Europe, Asia, and America tried to get in touch. Some came with smiles and promises, others with pressure and veiled threats. Still, the inventors stood firm. The refusal made headlines in small tech communities, then blogs, and finally mainstream media. African engineers reject Elon Musk's offer. One headline read, sparking debate around the world. Some said they were foolish, turning down resources that could have scaled their device globally. Others said they were heroes, finally standing up against the pattern of outside powers buying Africa's best ideas. But what many missed was that the device was already being used quietly in local communities. In villages with no grid access, the units were lighting homes and powering schools. In cities with constant blackouts, shopkeepers used them to keep businesses open. The inventors believed in proving their technology not in labs or conferences, but in real lives transformed. That made it impossible to ignore. Elon Musk may have been turned away, but his interest had already validated the importance of the invention. If someone of his caliber was willing to buy it, then it must be real. And that realization spread like wildfire. Soon, thousands of people across Africa were asking when they could get one. The demand was far greater than the small team could supply. Factories were discussed, partnerships within Africa explored, and governments began knocking on their door. This was no longer just about one invention, it was about the future of energy independence for an entire continent. And that is why the refusal to sell was so powerful. For once, Africa was not just participating in global innovation, it was leading it, and no amount of money could buy that pride. The inventors themselves remained humble. They did not seek the spotlight, nor did they want to become celebrities. What they wanted was simple: to prove that power should be free, accessible, and in the hands of people, not corporations. Their journey had not been easy. Years of being ignored, mocked, and underfunded had forced them to find creative ways to build their prototypes. They salvaged parts, rewired discarded machines, and tested relentlessly. Each failure taught them something new until finally success arrived. It was not a sudden breakthrough, but a slow, steady process of persistence. That persistence became their shield when outsiders tried to lure them with quick rewards. Because they remembered the nights with no electricity, the families using candles, the children studying under streetlights. They remembered why they started, and that memory was more valuable than any billionaire's offer. And so, the legend grew. We began calling the inventors visionaries, rebels, even the African Teslas. But they rejected that label too, saying they were not following anyone's footsteps, only carving their own. Still, comparisons to Nikola Tesla were inevitable, given how his work had also been suppressed and sidelined in favor of corporate-friendly alternatives. The irony was not lost on Musk either. Here he was, named after Tesla, trying to acquire a technology that echoed Tesla's dream of free power. And yet, the story repeated itself. Someone had chosen not to sell, not to compromise. But this time, the story was being written in Africa, and that changed everything. Musk's team did not give up immediately. They tried multiple approaches, from technical collaborations to licensing deals. One proposal was to integrate the African device into Tesla's energy storage systems. Another was to use it as a backup power source for SpaceX missions. They even suggested creating a joint African research hub funded entirely by Tesla. But the inventors knew what that really meant. It meant control would slowly shift away from them, and eventually, the technology would no longer belong to Africa. So once again, they refused. By this time, word had reached African leaders. Some governments wanted to nationalize the invention, claiming it belonged to the people. Others wanted to tax it heavily, fearing a collapse of their fossil fuel industries. Still, the inventors held their ground. They were determined not to let politics swallow their dream either. Instead, they began quietly distributing prototypes to trusted communities. In one village, a single unit powered an entire water pumping system. In another, classrooms stayed lit long into the night, allowing children to study without interruptions. In towns where small businesses constantly lost money during blackouts, the devices kept refrigerators, computers, and lights running. Each success story strengthened the inventors' resolve. Elon Musk, watching from afar, must have realized that money alone could not win this time. For someone who had built his career on bold risks and big acquisitions, this was a rare defeat. The refusal sent a ripple effect through the energy world. If Africa really had a self-powered device, then every energy corporation on Earth was facing a threat. Oil companies worried about collapsing demand. Battery producers feared their investments would be obsolete. Grid operators saw their business model evaporating. The invention had not yet gone mainstream, but its shadow was already terrifying powerful industries. The inventors, however, did not think in terms of markets or industries. They thought in terms of people. They thought about mothers no longer cooking in darkness, children reading under electric lamps instead of candles, hospitals running equipment without diesel generators. They thought about entire communities being free from monthly bills and families keeping more of their hard-earned money. This people-first approach made them different from every corporation that tried to buy them. It also made them harder to control. The pressure increased. Whispers began of sabotage attempts. Strange offers of partnership came with conditions hidden deep in contracts. Anonymous warnings suggested they stop before something bad happened. Yet they kept going, because for them, the fear of losing the dream was greater than the fear of any threat. And that dream was contagious. Students in universities across Africa began experimenting with similar designs. Makers and DIY engineers started posting videos online, inspired by the idea of self-powered systems. The movement was spreading whether corporations liked it or not. Meanwhile, Musk faced questions from journalists. Was it true he had tried to buy an African invention and been rejected? He neither confirmed nor denied it, but his silence only added to the mystery. Speculation exploded online. Forums buzzed with theories. Some said Musk was secretly still negotiating. Others believed he had been completely cut out. Either way, the story had gone global, and for the inventors, that meant their device was no longer a secret. People from around the world began reaching out. Emails, calls, and even personal visits flooded them with attention. Some were genuine admirers, others were opportunists, but they had learned how to say no. What they said yes to, however, was community. Instead of rushing to mass production with foreign investors, they focused on building an African supply chain. Factories were set up in small stages using local workers. Components were sourced from regional suppliers wherever possible. Training programs were launched to teach technicians how to maintain and repair the devices. The vision was clear: an African technology built in Africa for Africa. This was unprecedented. Most of the continent's natural resources, gold, diamonds, oil, lithium, had been extracted and shipped abroad. But this time, the value was not leaving. This time, it was staying. And that decision made all the difference. Because suddenly, Africa was not just a provider of raw materials, it was the owner of cutting-edge intellectual property. That intellectual property was priceless. And Musk, for all his resources, could not put a price on it. The inventors were rewriting history, and the world was forced to watch. As units rolled out, more testimonies appeared. A farmer in Nigeria reported running irrigation pumps all day without fuel costs. A school in Kenya stayed connected to the internet for the first time without interruptions. A hospital in South Africa used the device to power critical equipment during outages. Each story carried weight. Each story proved that this was not science fiction. This was reality. And reality is much harder to suppress. The African press began celebrating the invention as a symbol of continental pride. For once, the headlines were not about poverty, war, or corruption. They were about innovation, resilience, and self-reliance. The inventors became symbols of hope, though they never asked for it. They remained focused, quietly building, quietly expanding. And in the background, Elon Musk had to move on. But one thing was certain: he would never forget the day Africa told him no. And that no would echo louder than any deal he had ever signed, because it meant Africa was finally stepping into its power, literally and figuratively. It meant the world had changed, and there was no going back. The invention quickly became the subject of heated debate at universities and research institutions across the globe. Professors who had dismissed free energy concepts for decades were suddenly forced to confront the undeniable results from Africa. Students who once studied physics in textbooks now demanded experiments that mirrored what the African team had achieved. In laboratories from Europe to Asia, whispers grew louder. Had Africa cracked a code the rest of the world had ignored? Some researchers tried to replicate the design, but without access to the precise methods and configurations, their results fell short. The inventors had carefully guarded the inner workings of their device. Not because they wanted to hide knowledge forever, but because they knew what would happen if they released it too soon. Corporations would swoop in, patent fragments, and strangle the idea before it could spread. So they chose a different path. Rather than publishing papers, they chose to let their invention prove itself in practice. Let the world see homes lit up, machines running, lives changing. That was their proof. And proof is far more powerful than theory. As the device gained attention, powerful lobby groups began to stir. Oil executives quietly lobbied governments to investigate, regulate, or ban the technology. Battery manufacturers worried that their multi-billion-dollar investments were about to become worthless. Utility companies whispered about grid destabilization and unregulated hazards. But ordinary people did not care about corporate fears. They cared about the fact that for the first time in history, energy was within their reach without conditions. The story of one small town in Ghana captured global attention. For years, the town had suffered rolling blackouts, sometimes going days without power. Businesses had closed, children had studied under lanterns, and families had lived with constant uncertainty. Then, the inventors delivered just 2 of their devices. Within hours, shops were buzzing with lights, radios were playing music again, and the local clinic had power to run equipment. The change was immediate, visible, and undeniable. Journalists visited, filmed, and reported. The video went viral. Millions of people saw the smiling faces of villagers turning on electric fans and refrigerators without fuel or grid connections, and suddenly, the device was no longer just an invention, it was a movement. Meanwhile, Elon Musk still watched from afar. His companies thrived on innovation, but innovation that could be scaled, packaged, and sold. This African invention defied that model. It was too independent, too liberating. Owning one meant you no longer needed Tesla Powerwalls or solar arrays. It meant you no longer needed charging stations for electric cars. It even meant rockets and space stations could, in theory, carry infinite onboard energy. For Musk, it was a dream and a nightmare at the same time. But for the inventors, it was simply a gift to the people who had waited too long for power, and the people loved them for it. Crowds cheered them at local events, though they remained modest and reserved. They reminded everyone that the real victory was not theirs, but the communities now free from darkness. This humility only made them more beloved. In South Africa, where energy crises had plagued the nation, the devices became a hot topic in parliament. Some officials praised the invention as salvation. Others condemned it as a threat to national industries. The debates grew fierce. Should the country embrace this disruptive technology or try to regulate it before it destabilized existing systems? The inventors gave no speeches. They simply kept building, distributing, and proving. Their silence was louder than any argument, because while politicians argued, the lights in villages kept shining, and that reality was impossible to dismiss. Soon, African diaspora communities abroad began demanding access too. From London to New York, Africans living overseas wanted their families back home to benefit from the device. Some even pooled money to purchase units and ship them back to their villages. The movement spread not through corporate marketing, but through love and connection. It was grassroots energy distribution unlike anything the world had ever seen. And the more it spread, the harder it became to contain. International media finally caught on. Major news outlets ran features. Documentaries were filmed. Headlines blared Africa's free power revolution and the invention the West can't buy. Talk shows debated whether it was real or a hoax. Experts argued on television, some defending the science, others dismissing it. But the cameras could not deny the lights glowing in African homes that had been dark just weeks before. No theory could erase what people were experiencing firsthand. And that made skeptics look increasingly foolish. The inventors became symbols not just of innovation but of resistance. Resistance to exploitation, resistance to the idea that Africa's best resources had to be sold abroad, resistance to the narrative that only Western labs could create breakthroughs. This was an African answer to centuries of doubt, and it came not with words but with watts. As momentum grew, the question shifted from "is it real?" to "what happens next?" Governments scrambled to react. Energy ministers worried about collapsing revenues from oil exports. Investors feared losing billions in energy infrastructure. But ordinary Africans only asked one thing: when will my family get one? The inventors worked tirelessly, but demand far outpaced supply. Factories needed to be expanded, workers trained, logistics improved. They faced challenges at every step, from material shortages to distribution hurdles. But unlike corporations that delayed solutions for profit, they pushed forward with urgency. Because every delay meant another child studying in darkness, another clinic without power, another family trapped in the cycle of energy poverty, and they refused to accept that. Meanwhile, Musk made one last attempt. Through intermediaries, he offered not just money but collaboration on Mars colonization projects. He argued that their device could power off-world colonies, making humanity truly multiplanetary. For many, such an offer would have been irresistible, but the inventors saw through it. They knew that if they accepted, their technology would be locked away, used for space elites, while ordinary people still lived in darkness on Earth. So they refused once more. And with that, the chapter with Musk closed. It was not hostility, not anger, just a firm belief that their destiny was not for sale. And that decision cemented their place in history. Because rarely does anyone say no to one of the richest men in the world. But they did. And in doing so, they spoke for millions who had been voiceless. The story spread like wildfire across social media. Memes, tweets, and posts flooded the internet. Africa said no to Musk, one meme declared, showing villagers smiling with glowing lights behind them. The symbolism was undeniable. For centuries, Africa had been taken from. Now, for once, it was giving to itself, and no billionaire could buy that.